Welcome to the Evidence Informed Teaching Podcast. Are you a teacher wanting to improve your classroom practice and deliver excellent teaching through access to research? Do you have a passion for teaching and are looking to connect with other like-minded colleagues through professional discussions? The Chartered College has partnered with TeacherTap to support teachers to deliver excellent teaching through access to research, and we invite you to be part of this community. On this podcast, you will hear from fellow teachers, research experts, and you have the opportunity to be part of this professional discussion. You can find out more about the Chartered College of Teaching and TeacherTap in the show notes, and if you find this episode helpful, why not share it with a teacher friend, take a screenshot and post it on your social media, or even better, leave us a 5-star written review.
So I'm here today with Gerlinde Achenbach, who is a newly designated Fellow of the Chartered College of Teaching. Good morning, Gerlinde.
Good morning. Delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No, you're very, very welcome. Now, I'd love to start off because it may well be that colleagues listening to this are intrigued. How do you become a Fellow? Can you tell us a bit about your career to date?
I am a former primary head teacher. I've been in education, actually in primary education, for over 30 years. I finished up as a head teacher of 2 schools in a local authority federation of primaries in South East London. And we did an awful lot of work around researching effective pedagogy, looking at effective assessment systems and procedures, reducing workload for teachers, amongst many, many other things. And since leaving headship, I've actually worked, I'm now working as a consultant, an education consultant, specifically in plus equity, inclusion and belonging. Inclusion has always been one of my passions, specifically LGBT plus inclusion, having lived and worked in schools throughout Section 28. I know how challenging it has been for the LGBT plus community to be able to be themselves in schools, and to support young people who themselves identify within the community. So that's now one of my passions, is to spread the word as much as possible about being as inclusive as possible in our schools. So I work with schools up and down the country, primaries, secondaries, looking at strategies that they can put in place to help them to be as inclusive as they can be for our community. And I also, at the same time, I'm a leadership coach, and I work with schools on school leaders on school improvement.
So you're not bored then?
No, I'm not bored. I've got plenty to keep me busy.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Now, colleagues listening will know that there was a new consultation document that was put out by the DfE in December. It's a draft for consultation, and they're very keen. It's a consultation around gender questioning children, and they're very keen at the DfE that colleagues respond, and the survey ends on the 12th of March. And we thought it would be really helpful to ask you some questions about why you think this consultation is so important. So can you start by saying, yeah, exactly that? Why would people bother responding to this?
Well, schools have been waiting for many years for some guidance from the government. It's a tricky issue within schools around making sure that you're keeping within the law, but also meeting the needs and best interests of the pupils that you're working with. So schools have been keen to know that they are staying within the law, and also ensuring that gender questioning, as the DfE has chosen to call them in this guidance document, that they're keeping their best interests at the forefront as well. It is very, very important that we do respond to this guidance. There are a number of challenging and contentious issues that have arisen with the guidance, and I'd like to go through a few of those with you this morning.
Please do. I mean, I'm guessing that you're particularly thinking about this term social transitioning and the way that's interpreted by the guidance. But over to you. Tell me what you particularly want to highlight to people.
Firstly, gender questioning. So, what does this actually mean? So, well, what we're talking about here is trans or transgender children. And the guidance does make a point of not using the term transgender or trans in relation to children. It uses the term gender questioning, describes this as a broad term that might describe children and young people who are asking questions about their biological sex and perceived gender identity. Now, schools will also be aware that there are children in their schools identifying as non-binary and gender diverse as well. Non-binary is where a person doesn't identify as either male or female, and gender diverse is where a person identifies with a range of genders. Now, for the LGBTQ plus community, these identities fall under the trans umbrella, and schools need to be considering their needs too. But whether we use the descriptors transgender or trans, non-binary, gender diverse, or gender questioning, we are talking here about the same thing. The small number of pupils, and for trans people, this is less than 1% of the population, who feel that their gender identity doesn't align with the sex assigned them at birth. So this guidance has been written for when a request to make a social transition has been made. What exactly is social transitioning? Well, this is when a person makes changes to the way they interact with people socially, often being known by a different name, using different pronouns, or changing how they dress. So, for example, when a child who was born biologically female identifies as male and wants to express this through the way they present to others, for example, through their name, their pronouns, or their clothes. So just to repeat, the guidance has been written for when a request to do this has been made. Now, it's quite a substantial document with 18 pages dedicated to this topic. And following a forward from the Secretary of State for Education, Gillian Keegan, and Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, the guidance goes on to set out 5 overarching principles governing the contents of the document. Now, these include a school's duties to safeguard and promote the welfare of children, to have a no-tolerance approach to bullying, and to follow specific legal duties around the recording and reporting of biological sex. It also says that parents should not be excluded from decisions taken by a school or college where a child asks to socially transition. And the final overarching principle states that there's no general duty to allow a child to social transition. The guidance then goes on to a section on language and terminology, and following on from that, responding to requests from a pupil wishing to make a social transition and engaging parents. And then the final part of the guidance examines the details of a social transition request. So that includes the registering of name and sex, name changes, pronouns, and single-sex spaces, including toilets, changing rooms, and boarding and residential accommodation. I'd like to come back to the final overarching principle that there's no general duty to allow a child to social transition. What's clear is that each request must be considered on a case-by-case basis, and that the individual's needs and best interests must be kept paramount. There was some excellent guidance on provision for transgender pupils, jointly written in 2022 by a number of unions, including the NAHT, along with the Chartered College. And that guidance suggests that if in your risk assessments, you can show that safeguarding and the best interests of the child are at the forefront in all your decision making, this will put schools in their best place.
Yes, I think the risk around all of this is that hard-pressed school leaders will hear the words sort of legal challenge and so on and almost avoid confronting any of these issues rather than confront them and maybe get things wrong. And especially, as you say, it feels as if there's a very narrow tightrope to either responding or not responding, because ultimately we're talking about individual children and their sense of who they are. And it's really important that we understand all our children, isn't it? And that we have inclusive environments. But yeah, I can see that this is potentially problematic, quite scary for school leaders. So it's very helpful to have you explaining this so clearly. The advice is on the DfE website, and the consultation is available as well. And you're obviously doing a great job helping people understand the complexity of the whole agenda around diversity, equity, inclusion, LGBT plus, the whole kind of, we can't ignore this. As school leaders, we have to be responsive, don't we, to our young people and to the things they're thinking about and worrying about and loving about life. If we're somehow other than that, I think we risk being quite separate from the reality of young people's lives. So I'm very grateful to you. Is there anything else that you think we should particularly be helping our listeners to think about within this space that you would like to share?
The guidance is very clear on is a school's duty to keep parents and carers informed. And I think it's important to say here that whatever the concern or need around a child, schools overall do their level best to work with each child's parents and carers. And as you'll know, Alison, as a former head teacher in schools, a joined up approach to support is always the most effective one. Now, in a good number of cases where a child is asking to use a different name or pronouns, for example, parents and carers are already involved and supportive. And where this isn't the case, in my experience, schools will always try to work with the child to reach a way of including their parent or carer. And this might involve signposting the parent or carer to organisations or resources specifically for them. Now, there are instances when it might not be safe to involve a child's parents or carers, so where there's a safeguarding concern, and the guidance acknowledges this too, where informing them might lead to potential harm for the pupil. And as we know, safeguarding is defined by keeping children safe in education as where a child is suffering or is likely to suffer harm, could include being physically hurt or being forced to endure rituals or practices which could cause physical, emotional, or psychological harm. Schools' decisions to go ahead and make changes are reached after such a great deal of consideration of all the factors involved, not least in ensuring that pupil is well supported. And the draft guidance is suggesting that, barring where there is a safeguarding concern, parents will need to be both consulted and to give their consent. It states that schools should make parents aware if their child asks for a change in how they present at school, that the views of parents should carry great weight and be properly considered, and that parents should be asked for their consent to any changes in the vast majority of cases. Now, this is going to look different for schools if schools are following this guidance in this way. And they'll need to consider, schools will need to consider whether any change to their current practice would improve outcomes for their gender questioning pupils. The guidance is non-statutory, and schools really are best placed to decide whether their practice is within the law, and that is that it's not discriminatory, and we'll come to this in a moment, and that their practice puts the safety and welfare of the pupils first. Just to go on, there are several points of contention in the guidance, particularly around the use of pronouns and single-sex spaces. But there are, as I've just said, several contentious issues here. The first one that I'd like to tackle is its denial that children can be transgender and the insistence on using the term gender questioning. The reason that the guidance gives for this is that under UK law, under 18s can't get a gender recognition certificate, so they can't change sex. I would argue getting a gender recognition certificate from the age of 18 is completely separate from identifying as transgender. And particularly as the Equality Act of 2010 doesn't assign any age to the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And the government guidance to the Equality Act even talks about how gender reassignment applies to children. A second one I'd like to cover is around pronouns. So the guidance says that changing pronouns is a significant decision. I don't think anyone would disagree with this. However, the most significant feature here is where the guidance suggests that schools can decline a request from the child to change their pronouns, and that it's anticipated there will be very few occasions where such a request will be granted. It also says that in making that decision, the school must have consulted with the child's parents and considered the impact on the school community. It also says that there's no onus on a member of staff to use a child's preferred pronouns. Now, the difficulty here is that within the same section, the guidance insists that the bullying of any child must not be tolerated. And I think this is a very difficult situation to put schools in. On pronouns, the guidance specifically mentions primary children and says that primary children should not have different pronouns to their sex-based pronouns used about them. A challenge here, which affects several schools that I can think of right now, is the implication that even if a child has arrived at your primary school, having already made a social transition, and as I said, I can think of at least 4 such cases in the primary schools I've worked with recently, the guidance is suggesting that staff, when they're talking about the pupil, say in a pupil progress meeting or in a handover meeting between teachers, or if they're referring to that child in conversation with other pupils, should continue to use their sex-based pronouns and not the pronouns that they have chosen in their social transition. I can also talk about single-sex spaces.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of thing that people worry about when they hear these sort of headlines around these kind of issues. So yes, please do go on. How can schools manage this respectfully?
Well, the guidance is very clear that trans and gender questioning children should only be allowed to use toilets and changing facilities designed for their birth sex. So this applies to toilets for children over the age of 8 and changing facilities for those aged 11 and over. Now, the only exception to this is where the facilities are inside a completely enclosed, lockable cubicle designed for one person only. So the guidance suggests that trans and gender questioning people should use these. And my take on this is something like an accessible toilet, which might be available in school. One of the questions thrown up by this guidance is, should a trans girl then be forced to use the boys' toilets? And the law here isn't clear, and it's compounded by the protection of single-sex spaces. But good practice would seem to be where schools make every effort to make available inclusive facilities in addition to single-sex facilities. Best practice is, I feel, where a school offers both single-sex and inclusive facilities, which are available to all pupils. So if we can make these additional facilities available to all pupils, then we can avoid any stigma around who is using them. The guidance also advocates watchful waiting to see if this is a properly thought out decision on the part of the child. Now, in defence of schools, of course, they're not going to make snap or whimsical agreements with a child. And of course, this is a process that needs a careful and sensitive approach, which schools are well versed at. But it's probably worth saying here, just to put in a little bit of advice here, that there are many schools who are already doing some key things which actually benefit all children, and that includes those requesting a social transition. Firstly, using a chosen name at school is perfectly possible. Many children are known by and choose to use a name which is different from their legal name. The second is around uniforms. So schools can adopt a much less rigid and a gender-inclusive uniform. So one that lists items of clothing rather than specifying who should wear them. because of course clothes are only gendered if we make them so. And the third is that many schools now have non-gendered single cubicle toilet and changing facilities available to any pupils who prefer to use them. And I think if we can make accommodations like these, we're likely to be able to support all pupils, including trans and gender questioning children, to have a school experience which feels more inclusive and where they can be themselves.
I mean, this all seems incredibly sensible. What you've tried to do, and you've done so brilliantly for us in this podcast, is really to outline what the guidance is saying, to put some question marks where you feel there's a intended or unintended bias that is unhelpful potentially for youngsters. And you've also been so appreciative of the teaching profession. I love the way in which you are so kind of confident that schools will be trying to do all the right things and have already been trying to do all the right things. And schools will be trying to establish excellent relationships with all their pupils. I think increasingly schools are taking the view that as long as youngsters are well presented and smart and ready to be able to work and play, that's the most important thing. So thank you so much for taking us through this issue. And I really welcome the fact that you've become a fellow of the college. I think it's hugely important that we listen to a diverse range of opinions, and certainly the college we spend all our time trying to represent a plurality of voices. And as I've said recently, that actually as a profession, there's far more that unites us than divides us. Thank goodness.
That's very true.
So thank you so very much. And the consultation, as I say, closes on the 12th of March. So if you're listening to this and you have strong opinions, or you feel that you would really wish to contribute to the consultation, please do. And we will make sure that the college is reminding people that this is when the consultation closes, so that everybody has an opportunity, should they wish, to contribute. Yeah, thank you very much.
Fantastic.